What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for Doom Patrol Season 1 Episode 3, titled Puppet Patrol, which every episode it seems like will be titled something Patrol. Like the second episode was titled Donkey Patrol. It's every episode except for the first one, which is titled Pilot. It doesn't really matter at this point, but this episode obviously continued where the last episode left off. Now they're going on a road trip, or they went on a road trip to find Niles Caulder through Mr. Nobody, the guy who has him captured. So they go to Paraguay, and throughout the episode there are these flashbacks to Negative Man's origin story. There were like the continuation of what we saw in the first episode, as well as some of what we saw in the second episode, which was not flashbacks, but was more of like what he wants to see as a pilot. But now we have more, they're going more into depth on that, because I think some people wanted to see more of his backstory in the first episode, and we did get more of that in this episode, which I do think the flashbacks in this episode were actually pretty great. Like, they did a great job at fleshing out Negative Man's origin story and giving more context to everything that happened in the first episode, obviously making it a lot more emotional, a lot more sad in the end. And I do think they did not an incredible job, but a pretty great job at that whole flashback storyline in this episode. And it seems like Negative Man also had a lot of great conflict in this episode, or a lot of great moments with his negative energy side. I really like that dynamic, and I'm kind of excited to see more of that in the season. I do think they did a pretty great job at the flashbacks and everything to do with Negative Man in not only this episode, but in the show in general. I thought it would be very difficult to pull him and his powers and the conflict there off, but they're doing a pretty great job so far. Same goes with basically every other character, except for maybe Rita. We haven't seen her powers really. We might see them later in the season, but I think for Robot Man and Crazy Jane and Cyborg and Negative Man, they're doing a great job with the conflict and all their powers as well. So obviously this episode continued where the last one left off in terms of Niles Caulder. Now Niles Caulder is kidnapped by Mr. Nobody, which this is the first episode where neither of those two appeared, and I do think it was kind of noticed. I think both those characters were great in the first two episodes, and they kind of added a lot more to the episodes, which is why this is probably the worst of the season so far. Still a pretty great episode. So there's a whole road trip, and I do think that whole thing was a lot of fun. It didn't really last very long, so for like maybe 5 minutes, but it was a lot of fun nonetheless. And then they just teleport to Paraguay with just Vic and Rita staying behind, which was when the episode split into two different storylines, just like the last episode where there's two characters in a smaller storyline. In this case, it's Elasti-Woman and Cyborg, and then there's three different characters in the bigger storyline. In this case, it is Negative Man, Robot Man, and Crazy Jane. The one with Cyborg and Rita were just really talks and conversations between them, but the one with Robot Man, Crazy Jane, and Negative Man, that was a great storyline. I mean, they visited Paraguay, they had this whole puppet show, they even met this guy who later in the episode we saw he turned into Animal, Vegetable, Mineral Man, which is probably the most insane and craziest DC villain of all time. I've actually never heard of him before the show began, and people in the comments said that he might appear, and now he is probably the craziest villain. He actually appeared in the episode at the end, so that was pretty insane. But I do think the storyline was pretty great. Negative Man went through this whole thing, this whole conflict with his negative energy side, which I said earlier. I really liked that. It also obviously connected to the flashbacks. They didn't actually resolve that conflict in that storyline in this episode, but I am sure they will resolve it. If not in the next couple episodes, then definitely by the end of the season. But obviously the whole thing with the Robot Man and Crazy Jane and this evil scientist, that whole thing, that whole storyline was pretty insane. There were some insane fight scenes. Before all this, there was this whole puppet show, which is what the episode is named after, the Puppet Patrol, which had the evil Nazi scientist puppet show, and it showed how Mr. Nobody got his powers and how Niles Caulder fits into all of it, and also the doctor, I forgot his name, but that guy's origin story, how he got to Paraguay, why he's doing what he's doing. And I do think that that puppet show was actually a pretty great thing for this episode. I did actually like it. I think it did a great job at showing us all of the information, or telling us all of the information we needed to know for all of these characters, like Niles Caulder and Mr. Nobody and this evil scientist. So I do like that quite a lot. I like the fact that it didn't really take up much of the episode. It was like maybe 5 minutes, just like the road trip earlier in the episode. And even though the episode is titled Puppet Patrol, I do enjoy the fact that it was actually pretty short, and it did what it accomplished. It accomplished what it was trying to do, which was just tell us all the information we needed to know about these characters. But getting back to everything that happened after the puppet show, which was with Robot Man and Crazy Jane, where they fought a lot of these Nazis, I guess, these German guys who are working with this evil scientist, who it turns out he is still alive, I think. I'm pretty sure that was actually him, and the whole conversation between him and Crazy Jane, that was pretty great. I do like Crazy Jane a lot in this show. I really like how they're using her, and the one who could like turn in words into metal, the one that was in the main fight scene in this episode. I do like her powers. They're very unique, and I do think that they handled it very well in this episode. All the fight scenes in this episode were really brutal and really good, like with Robot Man just tearing people apart. I do think that was a great fight scene. I mean, it was very bloody, and you see at the end, Robot Man didn't really know what he was doing, had no control over himself, I guess, but still, it was a pretty great fight scene. And the one with Crazy Jane fighting all the same people in the other room, it was pretty insane, and this was probably like the first great fight scene of this show. I do really think they have a lot of great potential with all these superpowers, and I didn't really think Robot Man would work in a fight scene because he just moves so slowly most of the time, but it definitely really does, like the one in this episode. In the background of this whole storyline, there was another one with Vic and Rita, which was definitely the least interesting part of this episode. I wouldn't say it was a bad storyline. I wouldn't even say it was okay. It was pretty good, and nothing has been bad in this episode or this show really so far, so that's definitely good, but this definitely was the least interesting of the entire episode. I would say the most interesting part of this storyline was when Vic was wearing his hoodie, like the zipper was down for like the first time in the show. His actual costume looks really good. I don't know if it's CGI, I don't know if it's practical. If it's practical, it probably takes a really long time to put it on. If it's CGI, it's probably very expensive, which is why he wears a hoodie all the time for the budget of the show. But when it was down, it looked really good, and I really want to see more of his actual cyborg look, because at this point, when he's wearing the hoodie, he doesn't really look like Cyborg that much. But I would say when the hoodie was down and he had that whole robot torso thing, I mean, I do think it looks really good, probably better than how it did in Justice League, which is insane considering the budgetary disparities between Doom Patrol and Justice League. It is insane how the costume on Doom Patrol, minus the face area, actually looks better. So I do think that was the most interesting part of that whole storyline. Still, that was a pretty good storyline with some pretty good conversations between Vic and Rita. I didn't think there was much of a point to it, except for like giving these two characters some screen time together, which I do appreciate. I do like the fact that they did that. I mean, they had screen time in the last episode too, but still, it definitely was not a bad storyline. It just was easily the least interesting part of this episode. It just feels wrong to say it was bad or the worst part of this episode, because it wasn't bad at all. It was just the least interesting. Oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention was that in this episode, Aquaman was mentioned, which confirms that he exists in this universe, along with Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash, as well as the Justice League, which is just a pretty awesome, very nonchalant reveal. Just like basically every major DC character that's mentioned on the show and in Titans, it's so nonchalant how they mention it, like compared to how they would be mentioned in the Arrowverse, and I like that because it makes the universe feel very DC and makes it feel like a complete DC universe. So here you go, Aquaman is added to this universe as well. So in conclusion, this episode definitely continues the streak of Doom Patrol being the best live-action DC show in a very long time, and I'm hoping it continues and pulls off an incredible first season. But this was definitely the worst or least best episode of the season so far, so I will give it a 9 out of 10. But let me know what you thought about the episode in the comments down below, and if you liked this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.